In a quiet garage tucked behind a suburban house, Eli Mercer was hunched over the open fuselage of a small aircraft, his birthday gift from his wife, Naomi. His hands were stained with grease as he adjusted the internal systems, focused and steady. Late afternoon sunlight filtered through dusty windows, casting golden lines across the concrete floor. Naomi stepped in, dressed for business, her laptop bag over her shoulder. She told him she would soon be leaving for a conference in Geneva and invited him to come with her. Eli declined gently but firmly. He was buried in work. She smiled, not surprised. Some time later, Eli walked the clean corridors of Orion Intelligence Division headquarters. He passed through a full series of high-security checkpoints, scanners, and systems he had built himself, and entered the decryption and analysis department. There he began work as always, until a message popped up on his screen. It was from Lyra, the mysterious informant he had corresponded with for years. As usual, she had highly classified material to offer, but this time she warned him that the contents could shake the agency to its core. Eli tried guessing her location. Tangier, maybe? But Lyra dismissed the guess. He turned his attention to the encrypted data. Surprisingly, even a mind like his couldn't crack the code. After lunch, he returned to his desk and received a brief call from Naomi. She had already arrived in Geneva. Eli wasn't surprised. He had been tracking her flight. They exchanged a few words, but his mind was still on the encrypted files. Determined to make progress, he carried his laptop to a restricted lab with more advanced processing systems. Hours passed. Then finally the files opened, and what he saw made his breath catch. The documents revealed a top-secret operation. A drone strike disguised as a suicide bombing. The attack had killed 150 people, including French Special Forces and Danish Marines. The order had come from Director Silas Keaton, Eli's own boss. It had all been covered up. That night, Eli called Naomi. She didn't answer. He left her a voicemail. The next morning, he arrived at work to find Keaton already waiting. Without a word, the director led him to the office of Director Alana Wexler, the newly appointed head of the agency. She didn't waste time. There had been a terrorist attack at a hotel in Geneva. Naomi was one of the victims. Eli couldn't believe it. He asked to call her, but Keaton turned on the television. The news was playing. For armed terrorists had stormed a hotel, taken 4 hostages, and killed 2. Then came the security footage. Naomi appeared on screen. Eli froze. It was real. When he returned home, a crowd of reporters had gathered outside. Police were doing their best to keep order. A friend helped Eli slip into the house unseen. Inside, everything was quiet. Too quiet. The next day, Eli confronted Keaton and Agent Marcus Vellum. His voice shook with disbelief. How had the terrorists bypassed thousands of security cameras in Geneva? How had they vanished into traffic? Keaton told him the agency was investigating. Vellum told him to go home. The following day, Eli went to the airport to collect Naomi's body and her belongings. At home, he opened her suitcase and discovered a gift she had bought for him. He broke down, the grief too heavy to hold. Unable to stay in the house any longer, Eli returned to OID and accessed the restricted systems again. This time, he hacked into the hotel's camera network and the surrounding streets. He assembled a complete timeline of the incident and brought it to his superiors. The reconstruction was precise. The 4 terrorists had stolen a vehicle in the East End and entered the hotel through the service entrance. They had meticulously wiped all prints and DNA. They were scheduled to meet with executives from Impact Investments, a firm based in Indonesia. Something went wrong. An argument broke out in the hallway. One of the firm's guards became agitated. A terrorist opened fire, killing one and severely injuring another. Hotel security responded immediately. Police were called. In a desperate attempt to escape, the terrorists took several hostages. Naomi was among them because she had tried to help others flee. Using facial and voice recognition, Eli identified all 4 suspects. Dmitry Volkov from Moscow, Ruben Knox, a former South African Special Forces operator, Victor Drager, a mercenary, and Celeste Thorne, a former intelligence officer. But when Eli presented the findings, neither Keaton nor Vellum showed any surprise. That told him everything. They already knew. They simply said they were on it, and then sent Eli to see a therapist. The next morning, Eli embedded a custom chip into his OID badge. It was subtle, undetectable, designed to bypass internal security scans without raising alarms. With it, he walked through the agency's defenses as if nothing had changed. Once inside his office, he moved swiftly. He printed out every classified file connected to Director Keaton's black operations, then attached a skimmer to the printer, an innocuous-looking device capable of digitally copying the documents page by page. That night, Eli sat in a dimly lit bar, lost in thought. The jukebox before him flickered softly. He didn't touch it. He simply stared. The following morning, Eli returned to headquarters and walked into a meeting with Keaton, Vellum, and Director Wexler. Without hesitation, he placed the printed files on the table. Calm and direct, he listed Keaton's illegal actions one by one. The drone strike on a Syrian hospital, the hit on an Allied base in Yemen. The numbers were staggering. Civilians, allies, all erased with impunity. Then he issued his demand. Full CIA-level training, multiple fake passports, untraceable cash, a weapon, and every shred of intel on Naomi's killers. In exchange, he would keep the documents quiet. To back up the threat, he claimed he had activated a dead man's switch. If he failed to input a code every 5 hours, the documents would be sent to the international press. After the meeting, Eli reached the parking garage and leaned against his car. His hands trembled. He vomited into a nearby bin, the weight of the decision hitting him all at once. Inside OID, Keaton dismissed the threat. "He's bluffing," he said, but Vellum wasn't so sure. "Can we afford to take that chance?" They debated the risk, then turned to how Eli might have extracted the files. A skimmer? It wouldn't work on secured computers, but if he'd rerouted the files through a printer, it was possible. They reviewed internal footage and confirmed it. Eli had purchased a magnetic strip recently. Still, they couldn't figure out how he had slipped it in or out without triggering the system. They sent a team to search Eli's house. It didn't yield much, until they learned he'd visited the same bar twice. Agents headed to the location and began examining the jukebox. Underneath, they found an ABBA CD. Vellum selected it from the jukebox catalog. Nothing but noise came out. They retrieved the disc. It was clearly a disguise. Meanwhile, Eli arrived at the agency's off-site training facility. Colonel Trent Halvorsen greeted him personally. Training began without pleasantries. Eli was taken straight to the firing range. The results were unimpressive. He needed to be nearly point-blank to land a shot. But when it came to explosives, Eli moved with stunning precision. He assembled complex bomb systems faster than most experienced operatives. Halvorsen took note. From there, Eli was put through psychological conditioning. Halvorsen pushed him hard, knocking him down, testing whether Eli could still recite his alias and cover story under stress. He passed. The forged passport was finalized. That night, Halvorsen visited Eli in his quarters. "You're not a killer," he said. Eli replied, "I'm not after blood. I want justice." Halvorsen placed a gun in front of him and instructed Eli to aim at his chest. Eli lifted the weapon, hesitated, and lowered it. Back at OID, analysts decrypted the ABBA disk. The contents were a sophisticated bluff. There was no dead man's switch, no automatic data drop. They rushed to inform Keaton, who hadn't realized that Eli had been listening the entire time. The chip he had embedded earlier had been a bug, planted in the documents themselves. Keaton finally noticed something off about the files. He examined the edge and discovered the listening device. Keaton immediately called Halvorsen. "Arrest Mercer." But it was too late. Eli had already disappeared. Outside the facility, he tossed his earpiece and boarded a flight bound for Geneva. It wouldn't be his final destination. Lisbon was next. In Lisbon, Eli checked into a modest hotel located just across the street from a quiet restaurant. It was the perfect vantage point. Celeste Thorne, one of the 4 terrorists, was known to frequent that spot. When she appeared later that day, Eli was ready. He watched her enter, activated a tracker, and began monitoring her phone. That evening, He followed her back to her apartment building and waited until a tenant exited. Slipping inside, he made his way up and, using a basic lockpicking tutorial, gained entry into her home. Inside, he moved with precision. He took photos of her schedule, noted her routines, and discovered a handgun stashed in a drawer. He pocketed it. Then his tracker pinged. Celeste was returning. Eli darted into the stairwell to wait, heart racing. But when she arrived and walked past him, he couldn't do it. He couldn't pull the trigger. Frustrated, he retreated to his hotel. Shaken. To calm himself, he imagined Naomi was still there waiting for him, lying on the bed, safe and whole. Later that night, as he reviewed the photos of Celeste's schedule, he noticed frequent medical appointments. Curious, he hacked into her medical records and discovered she suffered from severe allergies. The next morning, he bought a large bouquet filled with pollen-heavy flowers. From a cafe across the street, he watched her until she made her way to the hospital. He followed discreetly. While she was undergoing a routine scan, the technician stepped out to investigate a flickering monitor. Eli, wearing a stolen lab coat, entered the room and sealed the door behind him. Celeste was trapped in the scan chamber. Eli triggered a small device, releasing concentrated pollen into the chamber. Celeste started to panic. Her throat swelled. She gasped for air. Eli stood outside, emotionless. "Tell me where Drager is," he said. "Tell me where Victor is, and I'll let you out." Celeste could barely speak. Desperate, Eli opened the chamber, but Celeste sprang out, slamming him into a nearby desk. They struggled violently, knocking over trays, monitors, chairs. Eli reached for his gun, but she struck it from his hand and escaped the room. He chased her through the hospital, out into the street. She didn't make it far. A speeding car hit her hard, sending her body tumbling across the pavement. Eli hesitated, then rushed to her side. She was still breathing, but barely. He grabbed her phone, then turned and fled, tossing the bloodied lab coat into a trash bin on the way out. Back at the hotel, Eli washed the blood from his skin and packed his things. That evening, he bought a bus ticket to Marseille and disappeared into the night. By the following morning, news of Celeste's death reached OID. Director Wexler questioned Keaton directly. "Was she one of ours?" she asked. "Seems that way," Keaton replied, emotionless. That night, Eli sat in a smoky bar in Marseille. He drank to dull the weight of what had happened. For a moment, he thought he saw Naomi dancing among the crowd, but it was just a stranger who looked like her. Then he saw someone else. Halvorsen. Eli bolted. He pushed through bodies out into the street, sprinted down narrow alleys and ducked into a second bar. But Halvorsen was right behind him. Eli locked himself in the bathroom. No windows, no exits, just silence and dread. He opened the door and walked out. Halvorsen was sitting at the bar, calm, controlled. "We found you through her phone," Halvorsen said. Eli lifted his own phone and showed him a countdown timer on the screen. Then he ran. Moments later, a bomb exploded in the bar's bathroom. Chaos erupted. Screams, smoke, fire. In the confusion, Eli escaped. His signal went dark. The next morning, he contacted Lyra. She arranged transport on a cargo plane to Tangier. There, he entered a quiet restaurant and sent her a message. Across the room, a man's phone rang. Eli moved toward him, but a woman stepped in his path. "Check your phone," she said. The message was clear. "Do not follow. Go outside." He obeyed. The same woman approached him again outside. It was her, Lyra. She already knew about Naomi. She handed him a shopping bag and told him to hide his cap and backpack. "Pretend to shop," she instructed. "We'll meet again in the garage." 5 minutes later, they reunited in the shadowed corner of a garage, and she drove him to her house. On the way, Lyra opened up. She told him her husband had been a CIA asset working inside Russian intelligence. He was the original Lyra. He had taught her everything. His death was officially ruled an accident, a fall from a window, but she knew it wasn't. At her home, Lyra explained that she had never stayed anywhere more than 3 years. She was tired of running. If the Russians ever came for her, She had a plan to end it quickly. Then, the two of them turned back to the case. Draeger, they discovered, was the man responsible for hiring the mercenaries. Reuben Knox was an arms dealer. Lyra offered to pose as a weapons trader to bait him out. As for Dmitry Volkov, he traveled often and posted constantly online. In one photo, a woman often appeared beside him. Lyra ran her image through facial recognition software. The result was fast and conclusive. Her Instagram showed she was in Barcelona. Back at OID, Vellum had ordered full surveillance on all 4 terrorists to try to triangulate Eli's location. Director Wexler warned Keaton directly. No more black ops operations without her approval. Keaton assured her he had things under control. After their meeting, Wexler returned to her car, where her assistant handed her a photo. Halvorsen had been spotted in Spain. Keaton had dispatched him. Wexler quietly ordered one of her own agents to follow. In Barcelona, Eli and Lyra hacked into a luxury hotel's security feed and confirmed Volkov's location. Eli checked into the same hotel. He learned that Volkov liked to swim in the rooftop pool that connected the 2 buildings through a glass corridor suspended in the air. At the same time, Halvorsen arrived in the area. Tomorrow, Eli would make his move. The next day, Eli began constructing a custom device specifically designed to sabotage the rooftop pool that bridged the twin towers of the hotel. The pool was a long, transparent tunnel suspended high above the street, and he concealed the device inside an access panel without drawing attention. Later that evening, as Dmitry Volkov arrived at the bar, Eli followed, staying alert. Something felt off. He noticed a man at the counter whose posture and gaze marked him as surveillance. Eli had seen him before and quietly informed Lyra. She scanned the feed and confirmed it. CIA. Then she spotted Halvorsen on another camera. Abort! She urged through the earpiece. Eli refused. I'm finishing this. Volkov, unaware, made his way to the rooftop pool. Eli waited until he was inside the transparent corridor suspended between the 2 buildings, the warm lights of the city glowing beneath. He followed and confronted him midspan. Volkov looked up as Eli approached. Where's Draeger? Eli asked. Volkov gave a smirk. What, are you going to drown me? Eli didn't answer. He raised the remote and pressed the trigger. A hairline fracture split across the glass. Volkov's face changed. He turned and swam for the far end. The glass cracked deeper. Then, with a deafening groan, the tunnel gave way. Water erupted in a cascade, crashing down onto the street. Volkov disappeared with it. Eli turned immediately. Lyra's voice returned in his ear, guiding him through the corridors as the building's alarms began to blare. As he moved through the lower levels, he arrived at the laundry room just in time to see Halvorsen locked in close quarters combat with the CIA agent who had been tailing him. The 2 men fought brutally, slamming each other into machines and metal carts. The agent managed to draw a weapon, but Halvorsen overpowered him, disarmed him, and fired. The agent fell. Eli stood in the doorway, torn between watching and running. Lyra spoke again. Don't stop. Keep going. Eli fled the facility. At OID the next morning, Director Wexler summoned Keaton. She asked where Eli was. Bereavement leave, Keaton said without blinking. Wexler slid a folder across the desk. Inside were surveillance photos from the hotel in Lisbon Eli disguised captured on camera. He had help, she said. Meanwhile, Vellum and his team reviewed the same footage. Digging into Eli's communications, they found traces of encrypted exchanges linked to a defunct codename Lyra. Digging deeper, they found the file of the original Lyra, long confirmed dead. Then they discovered his widow. She had taken on his alias and his mission. That night in Tangier, Eli and Lyra slept side by side, fully clothed. Both 2 used to running to rest properly but too tired to keep watch. For the first time in a long time, neither of them felt alone. But their moment of peace didn't last. Just before dawn, Lyra's birds stirred noisily. Red lights blinked on the security monitors. Dozens of agents were converging on the house. With no time to waste, Lyra grabbed her prepared pack and opened a hidden wall panel. Behind it, a tunnel led to a secondary building. They slipped inside moments before the house was breached. Outside, a surveillance drone hovered overhead. Inside, Lyra's security system began wiping every file and clearing the drives. Eli and Lyra moved fast, climbing through back exits and into another street just before the system completed its purge. They made it to the beach and reached her parked car. But the drone had already spotted them. Gunfire tore across the shoreline. They jumped into the vehicle and sped off. A boat joined the chase from the water. Bullets ripped through the windshield. Lyra gritted her teeth, swerved hard, and took another hit. Blood spread quickly across her shirt. She slumped. Eli grabbed the wheel, keeping pressure on the accelerator while glancing toward her. Her eyes were closing. He drove for miles, finally shaking the boats and black SUVs. Only then did he stop. She was gone. He didn't speak. He touched her hand once, gently, then drove to a hidden garage, covered her body with a cloth in the passenger seat, and sealed the doors behind him. No tears, just stillness. The next day, Eli contacted Reuben Knox using a false identity, posing as an arms dealer. He arranged a meeting, then purchased clean electronics, created a new digital profile, and traveled to Slovakia. There, in an abandoned building, he set up a feed showing his own face in Berlin. It was a trick, a decoy to mislead OID surveillance. When Knox arrived, he found a phone sitting on a chair, ringing. He answered it. Eli's voice instructed him to open the metal case in front of him. Knox did. Inside, he found a bomb rigged to trigger with the slightest motion, and a photo of Naomi. Eli stepped into view. "I want Drager," he said. Knox didn't hesitate. "He's in Russian waters. He uses a Baltic seaport. He only receives messages through codes from his inner circle." Knox dropped his phone. Eli picked it up, turned, and walked away. A moment later, the bomb detonated. The CIA received reports of Knox's death in Slovakia. Their agents had been monitoring Berlin, exactly as Eli planned. In a quiet hotel room in Norway, Eli finally opened the small puzzle Naomi had once packed for him. Inside was a handwritten message. He smiled softly, closed his eyes for the first time in days, and rested. The next morning, he traced the registration of a yacht parked at the seaport and identified a man nearby using the code phrase meant only for Drager's inner circle. The man checked his phone. Then he looked toward the yacht. That was all Eli needed. He followed him discreetly, took photos, returned to his room, and began mapping the yacht's sea routes. Tomorrow he would board it. Tomorrow he would end it. At dawn, Eli approached the yacht. It sat quietly at the edge of the harbor, sleek and unmarked. As he neared the stern, footsteps rushed behind him. Something struck the back of his head hard. Everything went black. His fingers lost grip of Naomi's puzzle box. It fell, untouched, onto the pier. He awoke on the yacht, wrists tied, vision still fuzzy. Across from him sat Victor Drager. On the table between them was the very bomb Eli had planted for another operation. Drager had found it. He wasn't angry, just curious. "You killed the others without flinching," he said. "But me? You came in person. I'm flattered." Eli didn't respond. Drager leaned forward. "You're not a killer. That's the problem. You want justice, but you don't want blood on your hands." He slid a handgun across the table. "Go ahead. Take your revenge." Eli reached for it, but his hands trembled. After a long pause, he placed the gun back down. Suddenly, the yacht shifted. A rumble from below. Drager's head turned slightly. "What was that?" Eli said nothing. The yacht shifted again. Outside, crew members shouted. Engines roared. The navigation system was no longer under manual control. "What did you do?" Drager demanded. Eli finally spoke. "I helped design the security protocols on this vessel. You thought it couldn't be hacked." Through the windows, the horizon changed. The boat was turning. Approaching Navy ships became visible, flags of Norway, badges of Interpol. Alarms blared. The yacht slowed as patrol ships surrounded it. On the deck, agents in full tactical gear boarded with speed and precision. Drager stood frozen, disbelief in his eyes. Interpol officers stormed the main cabin. Within minutes, the entire crew was detained. Drager was handcuffed and removed without a word. Eli stood by the window, breathing slow, watching the sea. Back at OID, Director Alana Wexler held a press conference. She stood before a full wall of cameras and journalists, a confident presence behind the podium. "Today," she began, "we confirm the dismantling of an illegal black ops network that misused federal intelligence infrastructure and international contractors for unauthorized operations. Names were not listed, but the impact was clear. Keaton's empire had fallen." Later that evening, on the steps of the main OID building, Colonel Halvorsen waited as Eli approached. The two men stood in silence for a moment. Then Halvorsen spoke softly. "Didn't think you'd make it this far." Eli looked past him. "Neither did I." He left without fanfare. No press, no handshake, no recognition. He visited Naomi's grave that same week. The cemetery was quiet. He stood for a long time without speaking. The wind moved through the trees. He left her puzzle box, now sealed again, on the grass near the headstone. Then he went to the hangar. The small aircraft Naomi had given him was still waiting, quiet, untouched. He rolled it out, ran the checklist, and powered the engine. The sound was clean, clear. He taxied out to the edge of the strip, eyes locked ahead. The nose lifted, the wheels left the ground, and the plane rose steadily into the sky. For the first time in a long time, Eli Mercer flew free. Above the coastline, Eli Mercer piloted the aircraft with steady hands, his eyes focused on the endless blue horizon. The cabin was quiet except for the hum of the engine and the wind gliding over the wings. In the passenger seat beside him, there was nothing but the memory of Naomi. Her voice, her strength, the gift she had given him that now carried him forward. The same plane, the same sky, but the world below had changed. He had dismantled a shadow network built on lies, death, and silence. Victor Drager had been captured. The truth behind Naomi's murder had been uncovered and avenged. And the black ops machine engineered by Silas Keaton had been dismantled in full view of the global community. Eli hadn't done it through brute force. He had used the system he once built, the intelligence infrastructure he helped perfect. He had outplayed them all. And in doing so, he had ensured that the same machine could never be used to destroy another innocent life. In the weeks that followed, headlines spread across every major outlet. Former OID officials were arrested. Foreign mercenaries were tracked down and extradited. Investigations were launched into agency oversight. Leaks surfaced confirming the details Eli had uncovered. Drone strikes hidden as terrorist attacks, covert bombings on Allied bases, unauthorized executions. But Eli's name was never mentioned. He was a ghost, a silent hand behind the reckoning. Those who knew whispered of him only in code. A man who had vanished from the system he once helped protect. Who had gone rogue not for power, not for revenge, but for truth. And for love. Plane cruised higher. Eli leaned back slightly in the seat, his hands loose on the yoke. He thought of Lyra, of Halvorsen, of Wexler, of Volkov, Knox, Thorne, Drager, of the coded messages, the midnight flights, the listening devices. He thought of the moment he saw Naomi in that grainy hotel footage, and the silence that followed. He didn't need recognition. He didn't need headlines. He had finished the work. And now, far above the world that could never understand the cost of what had been done, Eli Mercer flew on.